my first message, Mr. President slash Speaker, is that we're all glad that you are safe and sound, and we're all very sorry that you had to go through the terrible challenge that you did. I enjoyed my conversation with you earlier this morning too. We have a lot of work to do. Madam Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina, thank you so much for hosting this very important summit. And thank you also for the courtesies you showed me a little while ago when I visited Bangladesh. And we appreciate enormously the commitments you have made and the leadership that you offer. As you all know, President Biden is a breath of fresh air compared to what we went through in the last 4 years. And he is deeply committed to seeing that the climate crisis is dealt with the appropriate responses, with the necessary responses. And I can tell you with assurance that fighting the climate crisis is a top priority of the Biden administration. And it began with his appointment, effectively pulling me out of retirement and putting me back into this fight in order to try to help coordinate our efforts as we move towards Glasgow. It is also why President Biden, within hours of being sworn in as president, signed the appropriate papers to put the United States back into the Paris Agreement. And it is why we submitted a new nationally determined contribution, which meets the urgency of the challenge. We will we are planning, and we are in the throes of already doing the things necessary to cut our emissions by 50 to 52% from 2005 levels by 2030. And we are on track with that to keep the 1.5 degrees alive. I will also say to you that I'm very pleased that with the summit that we held in April, that we brought 55% of global GDP made a commitment to try to keep the 1.5 degrees. And that includes the United States, Canada, Japan, the UK, EU, and a number of other friends. And when you add them up, it equals 55% of global GDP. But obviously, my friends, that leaves 45% of global GDP still not committed to keep the 1.5 degrees. And we know that we have to do better than we're doing now. I mean, there's no other way to put it. So within these next 4 months leading up to Glasgow, I intend to put significant effort into making sure that we are dealing with reality. You have just talked about, and a number of the presentations have talked about, the existential nature of this crisis and its threat to the people of your nations, to the planet. The fact is that there's too much talk about it being existential and not enough response that actually is commensurate with it being existential. And so Glasgow has to be a moment of confrontation with the truth about where we are relative to where we need to be. The simple fact is this: we can't just have corporations or individuals or states, nation states, say that we are going to set a goal of 2050 net zero. Why? Because if you don't say what you're going to do and it isn't adequate for what we will do between 2020 and 2030, we can't get to net zero by 2050. 2020 to 2030 is the key decade of decision. It's the precursor to our ability to be able to meet our goals. And for you, the vulnerable nations, that 1.5 degrees is critical, or something very close to it. Remember, the promise in Paris was not 2 degrees, it was well below 2 degrees. And well below 2 degrees is certainly not 1.9 or 1.8, but currently, honesty requires us to acknowledge that on the track we are on now, without the implementation of some promises made. Just the business as usual track is right now taking us well above 2 degrees, well above 3 degrees probably. And some scientists will tell you it may even be in the 4 degree to 4.5 degree track. That's without the promises that have been made being implemented. So it is more critical than ever before that we come together, that we raise ambition. Those 45% of the nations not yet at the levels necessary to keep it alive, to keep 1.5 alive. It's not a promise we get there, but it keeps the opportunity alive. And the members of the Climate Vulnerable Forum and the V20, you folks understand, I mean, you don't need me to tell you what the implications are. You understand them better than anybody. But literally, I know some of you well personally. I know that your conversations have altered from talking about fullness of adaptation or resilience to even thinking about where you may have to move to, or may have to move millions of people if the worst consequences occur. So I commend your efforts to bring climate action into the halls of finance, into the ministries around the world. And your role as finance ministers is particularly critical because, yes, we have to fund this transition. And the primary responsibility to get it off on its right foot remains the commitments made by the developed world to achieve the 100 billion. That must be done. It is imperative that that COP26 Glasgow is the COP at which the 100 billion is fully realized. And the promise going forward is that we're going to do what we need to do to bring larger amounts of finance to the table in the following sense. Much of what we need to do to reach to deal with the climate crisis is related simply to energy policy. There's a lot that is also nature-based solution, but energy policy is what we directly control, and most importantly, is the greatest contributor to the crisis today, to the CO2 and greenhouse gas emissions. So we need to reduce those emissions rapidly, starting now, and do it faster than the current plans called for. But also, we need to recognize no government in the world can produce the amount of money that is necessary to effect this transition. And that's why the partnership with the private sector and the multilateral development banks is so critical. We must bring legitimate finance to the table. To that end, major institutions around the world have now begun to join different alliances and different groups, but all coming together to recognize that we need to set aside trillions of dollars. And so the 6 largest banks in America have made commitments of a floor over the next 10 years of putting $4.16 trillion into investment for climate-related activity. But your countries need to make a contribution to this in the sense that you need to make sure that some of that is going to be, that the largest part of that will be commercially viable. And it can be. Revenue is created in transportation. Revenue is created in energy purchases. Revenue is created in a number of different approaches to how one solves the climate crisis on a global basis. So I believe that in addition to that, yes, there has to be public funding. President Biden has pledged to double the climate finance that we provide to developing countries by 2024, to triple the adaptation finance that we provide by the same date. And he has also committed to raise the basic amount of money that we will be contributing. We also reaffirm the collective goal, as I mentioned earlier, of the 100 billion annually. And under our new climate finance plan, we are going to ensure that all international development assistance that we provide through bilateral channels takes climate into account so that the aid we provide will be resilient. We are committed to restarting U.S. financial contributions to the Green Climate Fund and to securing a strong IDA replenishment. And both of these will provide valuable resources for adaptation and resilience to the V20 countries. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen recently joined the Coalition of Finance Ministers for Climate Action, and the United States is going to be an active member there, and we will help countries make progress on climate-informed budgeting. And we're actively working with the IMF and our partners to channel special drawing rights, and that will obviously support health needs and help enable a greener, more robust recovery in most affected countries from the pandemic. And finally, we are supporting initiatives to build capacity in developing countries that measure and manage climate risk. And we believe that having disclosure requirements with respect to finance will be a critical component of the allocation of capital to those things necessary to effect this transition. So I thank you very much for your efforts. Most importantly, I would say to all of you, your voices need to be heard with intensity now for these next 4 months to guarantee that we move countries that have not yet sufficiently created a policy that will help to keep 1.5 degrees alive, and certainly to get well below 2 degrees. That is the major agenda of the planet right now, and I'm delighted to join you in those efforts on behalf of President Biden, who remains deeply committed to achieving our goals. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you for your continued support, Secretary Kerry.